The police station's interrogation room smelled like stale coffee and disappointment. Karen sat across from Detective Morrison, a weathered man who looked like he'd seen every kind of lie the world had to offer. Her hands were steady now, but her mind was racing through possibilities, escape routes, ways to salvage what was left of her dignity. "So, Marshal Middleton," Detective Morrison said, the title dripping with skepticism, "help me understand how a federal law enforcement officer ends up in a handcuffs dispute with HOA security guards." Karen leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact. "Detective, I'm sure you're aware that federal operations sometimes require agents to maintain deep cover for extended periods. My assignment in Willow Creek Estates has been ongoing for 18 months. 18 months. Morrison flipped through his notes. "That's interesting, because according to my records, you've been HOA president for 5 years. And before that, you worked at Meridian Insurance for 12 years. Not exactly the resume of a federal marshal." The walls felt like they were closing in, but Karen had come too far to back down now. "That's my cover, Detective. Meridian Insurance was a front. The HOA position gave me access to every household in the neighborhood, legitimate reasons to conduct surveillance, and the authority to investigate suspicious activities." She was impressed by how convincing she sounded, even to herself. Maybe in another life, she really could have been a federal agent. "What kind of suspicious activities?" Morrison asked, playing along. Karen hesitated for just a moment. Then she thought about Mrs. Peterson's smug face, about Jim Bradley recording her humiliation, about every neighbor who had ever questioned her authority or rolled their eyes at her perfectly reasonable requests. "Drug trafficking," she said quietly. "Money laundering. Possibly human trafficking. I can't give you details, but several residents in Willow Creek Estates are under federal investigation." Detective Morrison leaned back in his chair. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Middleton." "Marshal Middleton," she corrected automatically. "And yes, it is. Which is why I need to return to my assignment as quickly as possible. My cover may already be compromised." For the next hour, Karen spun an elaborate web of lies. She described fictional surveillance operations, invented suspicious behavior by her neighbors, and created an entire undercover persona complete with a backstory about federal training and years of service. With each detail, she felt herself becoming more invested in the fiction, more convinced that maybe, somehow, she could make this work. But Detective Morrison wasn't buying it. "Mrs. Middleton," he said finally, "I spent the last hour making phone calls. To the U.S. Marshal's Service, to the FBI, to Homeland Security. There is no federal agent named Karen Middleton. There is no undercover operation in Willow Creek Estates. And there is definitely no federal investigation into your neighbors." The words hit her like a physical blow. Karen felt her carefully constructed story crumbling around her. "However," Morrison continued, "I did speak with the city attorney. They're willing to work with you on the shed violation. Community service, a fine, but no jail time. The security company isn't pressing charges for the initial incident." Karen stared at him, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "But impersonating a federal officer is a felony, Mrs. Middleton. That's not something I can make go away." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Karen's throat felt dry, her hands suddenly shaky again. All those years of being dismissed, of being treated like her authority didn't matter, had led to this moment. She had wanted respect so badly that she'd been willing to steal it. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now you get a lawyer," Morrison said, not unkindly. "And you hope the federal prosecutor is in a forgiving mood." As they processed her paperwork, Karen's phone buzzed with messages. Her daughter, frantic with worry. Her ex-husband, threatening to sue for custody of their weekend visits. Mrs. Peterson, of all people, asking if she was okay. But it was the message from the HOA secretary that made her stomach drop. "Karen, emergency board meeting called for tomorrow night. Motion to remove you as president. I'm sorry." Even now, even after everything, they were still trying to take away her authority. Karen looked up at Detective Morrison, who was watching her with something that might have been sympathy. "Detective," she said quietly, "hypothetically speaking, If someone really was running drugs through Willow Creek Estates, would that change anything? Morrison raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Middleton, please tell me you're not about to confess to drug trafficking on top of everything else. No, Karen said, her mind racing. But what if I told you that I've spent 5 years documenting every suspicious activity in that neighborhood? What if I told you that Mrs. Peterson gets packages at odd hours? That the Johnsons never seem to go to work, but always have money for expensive cars? What if I told you that as HOA president, I've seen things that would interest law enforcement? She paused, watching Morrison's expression. What if I told you that maybe, just maybe, I stumbled onto something real while I was pretending to be something I'm not? Detective Morrison leaned forward, suddenly very interested. Mrs. Middleton, what exactly are you saying? Karen smiled for the first time in hours. Maybe her lie was about to become the truth after all. I'm saying, Detective, that you might want to take a very close look at Willow Creek Estates, because federal marshal or not, I've been watching those people for 5 years, and I've seen things that would make your badge stand on end. The interrogation room fell silent again, but this time, Karen felt like she was back in control. She might not be a real federal marshal, but she was about to become something even better, a confidential informant with 5 years' worth of neighborhood secrets. The question was, how many of her neighbors were about to discover that their HOA president had been taking very detailed notes? The next 20 minutes were a blur of frantic phone calls and hushed conversations. Karen sat in the back of the security company's van, no longer handcuffed but still under watch. As the guards made increasingly desperate calls to their supervisor, she could hear fragments through the thin partition. Says she's federal law enforcement. Could be a lawsuit. Need to verify. Her phone had been returned to her, and she clutched it like a lifeline. The lie had bought her time, but now she needed to figure out how to make it stick. She'd watched enough legal dramas to know that impersonating a federal officer was a serious crime, but getting arrested for HOA violations felt like the ultimate humiliation. At least this way, she might go down swinging. Mrs. Middleton? The younger guard approached cautiously. We're going to need to see some identification. Badge, credentials, anything that can verify your status. Karen's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression neutral. My badge is in my house, along with my service weapon and credentials. Which, by the way, you prevented me from retrieving when you illegally detained me. She was proud of how official that sounded. The guard nodded uncertainly and returned to his partner. Karen could see them through the van's windows, gesturing animatedly as they spoke into their radios. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter. Mom, Mrs. Chen says there are police cars in front of your house. What's going on? Karen's fingers flew across the screen. Just a misunderstanding with some overzealous security guards. Don't worry about it. But she was worried, very worried. The lie had seemed brilliant in the moment, but now she was trapped in it. If she came clean, she'd face the original charges plus impersonation of a federal officer. If she kept lying, she'd have to somehow maintain the deception while actual law enforcement got involved. The van door opened, and a woman in a police uniform climbed in. Karen's heart nearly stopped. Mrs. Middleton, I'm Officer Rodriguez. I understand there's been some confusion about your identity. Karen nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. These men detained me illegally while I was trying to resolve a civil matter. I'm going to need to speak with your supervisor about proper protocols when dealing with federal personnel. Officer Rodriguez studied her carefully. I'm going to need to see some identification, and I'll need to make some calls to verify your status. Of course, Karen said smoothly. But I should mention that I'm currently working undercover in this neighborhood. My assignment involves monitoring certain activities. That's why I haven't been able to maintain my cover residence to your city's satisfaction. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Undercover? Was she really claiming to be an undercover federal marshal? The absurdity of it might have made her laugh if she weren't so terrified. Officer Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Undercover? In Willow Creek Estates. I can't discuss the details of an ongoing investigation, Karen replied, channeling every cop show she'd ever watched. But I'm sure you understand the importance of operational security. For a moment, Officer Rodriguez looked uncertain. Then her radio crackled with an incoming call. She stepped out of the van to take it, leaving Karen alone with her racing thoughts. Through the window, she could see more neighbors gathering. The whole street was watching her downfall, and she felt a familiar rage building. These people had never respected her authority as HOA president. They'd questioned her decisions, ignored her rules, made her life miserable with their petty complaints and their ridiculous demands for community input. Well, now they'd see what real authority looked like. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her ex-husband. Karen, what the hell is going on? Jenny says you're in police custody. She stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could she say? That she'd finally snapped? That 5 years of being treated like a glorified mall cop had driven her to impersonate a federal agent. Instead, she typed, "Everything is under control. I'll call you later." Officer Rodriguez returned, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Middleton, I'm going to need you to come with me to the station. We need to sort this out properly." Karen nodded, but inside, she was calculating. How long before they discovered the truth? How long before her whole life came crashing down? As they led her toward the police car, she caught sight of Mrs. Peterson's satisfied smirk. That woman had been a thorn in her side for years, constantly complaining about HOA decisions, always stirring up trouble at community meetings. Maybe it was time Mrs. Peterson learned what happened when you crossed a federal marshal. Karen Middleton's hands trembled as she fumbled with her phone, trying to dial 911 while 2 uniformed security guards flanked her on either side. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into her wrists, and her perfectly manicured nails scraped against the concrete of her own driveway. "This is harassment," she shrieked, her voice cracking with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "I am the HOA president. You can't do this to me." The larger guard, a burly man with a crew cut, shook his head grimly. "Ma'am, we have a court order. You've been in violation of city ordinances for 3 months running." "What violation?" Karen's voice reached a pitch that made the neighborhood dogs start barking. "My lawn is pristine. My house is the best-maintained property in Willow Creek Estates." "The shed," the second guard said quietly, pointing to the small structure behind her house. "City says it's too close to the property line. Has to come down." Karen's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. Not to Karen Middleton, who had spent the last 5 years as HOA president, who had personally written 17 citations for mailbox violations, who had made grown men cry over the precise shade of beige allowed on exterior walls. "I built that shed with proper permits," she protested, but even as the words left her mouth, a cold realization crept in. Had she actually pulled permits? The whole thing had been such a rush job after the previous shed had been damaged in a storm. She remembered being so focused on getting it done before the next HOA meeting. The first guard's radio crackled. "Unit 7, what's your status?" "Subject is secured, but she's making a scene. Neighbors are starting to come out." Karen's eyes darted around the cul-de-sac. Mrs. Peterson from across the street stood in her doorway, arms crossed, wearing the smuggest expression Karen had ever seen. Jim Bradley from next door was actually recording with his phone, and he had the audacity to wave at her when their eyes met. "You people don't understand," Karen said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I have connections. I have authority here. I am not just some random homeowner you can push around." The guards exchanged glances. Karen caught it, that look that said they thought she was just another entitled suburbanite having a meltdown. The fury that had been simmering in her chest for months, ever since that new family moved in with their ridiculous garden gnomes, ever since the city started breathing down her neck about petty ordinances, ever since people stopped returning her calls, finally boiled over. "I am a federal marshal," she declared, her voice ringing across the quiet street. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The guards froze. Mrs. Peterson's mouth fell open. Even Jim Bradley's phone wavered. "What did you say?" the first guard asked, his grip on her arm loosening slightly. Karen felt a surge of power she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, she saw uncertainty in someone else's eyes. She straightened her shoulders as much as the handcuffs would allow. You heard me correctly, she said, her voice steady now, controlled. I am a United States federal marshal, and you gentlemen have just made the biggest mistake of your careers. The silence that followed was deafening, but in the back of Karen's mind, a small voice whispered what she refused to acknowledge. She had just told the biggest lie of her life.